Thanks very much, Finbar. It's, I think, a remarkable privilege to be here in Glenties at the MacGill Summer School. We've seen, I think, that MacGill is now, or for this week, that MacGill and Glenties are in fact driving the national conversation. And that's a conversation which we badly need in this country. We won't all agree, but it is important that we dialogue with one another and that we have, in a sense, going back to Edmund Burke, a distinguished graduate of Trinity College Dublin, that we have, in a sense, the ability to discourse and the ability to respect one another's views, and out of that then to respect the actions that are taken by those people whom we have entrusted with the responsibility for action. The other thing I have to say, and this is a personal tribute to Joe Mulholland, who of course is the MacGill Summer School and the team around him are the MacGill Summer School, but I spent since 1993 until about four and a half years ago involved in leadership positions in education, and I was never asked before until Joe Mulholland came along to write a paper on education policy. Papers yes, but not papers in. Now, have we frozen here, Charlie? Just let me check. Where's the page down? No, it's not. It's not moving. However, while that's been sorted out, we can continue. Oh dear. First thing I want to say is that the National Competitiveness Council, which I currently chair, produced a paper on education recently relating education policy to economic policy and to competitiveness. We were very conscious when we wrote that paper that education is, of course, about much more than economics. It's vitally, and competitiveness, it's vitally important for competitiveness and for economics, as indeed both Brian and John have said. But it also relates to culture, morality, ethos, religion, and social policy. And of course, it is the most important policy instrument for addressing the problems of disadvantage. Many of the proposals which we put forward in the NCC report, we believe will improve the relevance of the education system to addressing the overwhelming not overwhelming, but the overwhelming importance of meeting the education or the economic problems which we now face. But we also believe that they are relevant to the other domains of education. Thanks very much indeed, Charlie. So that's what I want to say, that I'm leaving the NCC report firmly in the harbour, and I'm pushing, in the best tradition of a summer school, I'm pushing the boat out further than the NCC report. So the NCC, or indeed any of the other organisations with which I'm associated, and that includes the regulatory body of the Chartered Accountants of Ireland, and it includes 4 Mile Water Hurling Club. None of those have any responsibility for what I'm going to say after this. Copies of the paper are available on those 2 websites. Joe, I don't know if you know that Patrick Honahan is putting all the papers of the summer school on the Irish Economy website. So there is, so as well as the webcast, there is instant access to all the texts. So I've said this: education is about much more than economics. But today, I'm going to talk about the economics. It took me 26 pages to cover the economics, which I'm not going to burden you with. The slideshow is much shorter, but you can read the full stuff on the website. So where are we? Education is hugely important for competitiveness and for economic recovery. We should aspire, and this is the point where we've got to raise our sights, we should aspire to having one of the best education systems in the world. Nothing but the best now going forward will be good enough, given the scale of the problems we face. I remember when the HEA a number of years ago proposed that Ireland should have one of the best third-level institutions in the world, third-level sectors in the world. A prominent academic phoned me up and said, "But look, that's far too ambitious." And I said, "Do you know why?" I said, "Because we have world-beating companies. We have companies like Kerry Group, we have companies like CRH, we have companies like Glanbia. And can we not support and propel Irish enterprise forward with one of the best education systems in the world?" "That's right," he said. "I was in Mexico recently and I saw that the Kerry Group dominated the whole dairy product sector in Mexico." So that's what we've got to aspire to be world beaters. Now, the point I'm going to make, which requires some reflection, is that outcomes rather than inputs are what are important. It's the end product. There are education systems in the world which are incredibly generously financed. For example, the Danish system. But they do not produce outcomes which are comparable with the best. And this raises issues of accountability and effectiveness, obviously. And this relates to the point, and I agree with Brian on this point, and with John, education spending cannot escape the need for fiscal adjustment. But it must be a priority for policy. And I think it was Danny McCoy spoke about how the Finns attached importance to innovation policy during their darkest hours in the 1990s. So I'm going to propose 3 guidelines which I believe should guide policy going forward and which should guide reform. And those are: pay attention to teacher quality and to the professional development of teachers. Without schools, or without teachers, schools have no purpose, have no core and no meaning. The teachers at all levels of education are the most important asset in the system. I'm going to argue that one of the strengths we have in the system is that parents and students have a degree of choice. They have degrees of choice about schools and higher education institutions, which are not available in many other countries. And that choice is something which we should treasure and nurture and indeed develop. And then I'm going to argue that government should stand back from direct involvement in the management of schools and of course higher education institutions, HEIs. But government is the core funder, the basic funder of the education system, and should use the funding system to incentivize excellent outcomes. Now, I'm saying this point about government standing back. Your comment there, Brian, about the Stalinist character of the Department of Education, I'll come back to that later. But I was the former General Secretary of the Politburo. Or maybe, Rory, you might prefer to use the word curia, but that's... And... I agree fully with John on this. We must sustain the policy priority for education, and research and innovation and technology transfer are included in that, despite overall reduced resources. One thing we have missed out on, which could be an important revenue generator for the system, is to exploit the opportunities for greater involvement in international education. And finally, coming back to the core point, at all levels, first, second, third and fourth, cherish and empower the teachers. So, just these first 2 points, education being so important. Why is education vital? Export success is the basis for our prosperity and capacity to deliver on social goals. And lest anybody forget this, there's the memorable phrase of Ken Whitaker when he sent the economic development document back in the late 1950s to government, and he said, the policy of import substitution, I'm not quoting him word for word, the policy of self-reliance has failed us to the point, he said, where the struggle to create an independent state is now in doubt. That was the seminal moment for the opening up of the Irish economy. And we are one of the most export-dependent countries in the world, and we rely for our prosperity and our capacity to create social progress and to register social progress on our ability to sell our goods and services on international markets. So our businesses need to be among the most competitive in the world, and knowledge is the key success factor. And just to illustrate how important knowledge is, and Frank Gannon, the Director General of SFI, gave me this chart, and I think it's very interesting. The World Bank divides the productive capacity of the wealth of nations under 3 headings. Our natural resources, our land, our seas, our minerals, and our mines. What we produce is the next heading. And the human and social, what somebody else said, what we carry around in our heads, and our social capital. Look at the position of Ireland. The human and social dimension is more important than it is for the group of rich countries. It's interesting, the comparison with Canada, and you can see much of the challenge, you can see expressed in that chart, the challenges faced by the poor countries in the world. So if we want one of the best, I'd like the discussion to focus on how we can achieve one of the best, how good are our outcomes? My answer, and some of you might dispute this, is that good but not good enough. It's like parenting. And there's a lot of detail in this chart, but the picture shows, you can see Ireland up there on where it should be on the left-hand side, but the left-hand side is also quite crowded. And to summarize it, we're very good on reading and literacy, we're reasonably good on science, and we're just about average on mathematics. These are the OECD results. That's not good enough. It's a cause for some would say encouragement. An area where we've been remarkably successful, and I think, Brian, you referred to this, has been the rapid transformation of the education landscape in terms of third-level attainments. And if you can read the colours on the graph there, you can see, if you look at the purple, how Ireland has forged ahead in terms of education attainments in the 25 to 34-year-old age group. So it's been a remarkable social transformation. In one generation, the children of parents whose highest level of education was primary education are now graduating from our universities and our institutes of technology. That's a remarkable key to our social transformation and indeed to our economic potential. And our third-level institutions are moving up in the world rankings, disputed though these world rankings might be. And John was far too modest to mention the fact that Trinity College is now in the top 50 worldwide and in the top 16 in Europe. And UCD is doing well, and I know there are Cork men in the room, and so is University College Cork and DCU. When it comes to investment, in the dreary days when I used to have to go over to the Department of Finance when I was in the Department of Education and Science and make the case for more investment in education, our relative position was appalling. In the OECD tables, Ireland ranked above Turkey and Mexico for spending on primary education. Now, the situation has improved quite considerably, but we are not among the high spenders on education. Incidentally, the pre-primary spending figure there is not really a relevant one because it refers only to the very small number of children that are in the pilot pre-primary programs. But the NCC encouraged considerable stepping up of investment in pre-primary education, and I'm delighted that the government policy now seems to be moving in that direction, despite the very harsh fiscal environment. So, one of the arguments I'll be making is that focusing on inputs, on expenditure, pupil-teacher ratios, can be a poor guide to policy and expenditure priorities. Lower class sizes do not automatically mean better student learning outcomes. Reducing class sizes is very expensive. It risks deflecting resources from other priorities. And the other priorities, for example, include the need for a very substantial investment in ICT and in broadband connectivity and in better facilities in schools, all of which would greatly empower teaching effectiveness. So coming back to the three guidelines. Teacher quality. Other countries would give their eye teeth for the quality of teachers we have in this country. Our primary teacher intake is drawn from the top 14% of the CAO cohort. You cannot now get into into a HDIP course effectively without having either a first-class honours degree or a 2-1. So the best and the brightest are going into teaching. It is a noble profession, and it is important that our teachers be well paid, and that's something in the department, when I was in the Department of Education and Science, my colleagues in the Department of Finance, which of course probably they saw it as their job to do so, criticised the relative high pay of Irish teachers. I always defended it, because without the best and the brightest in teaching, we're not going to get quality outcomes. And it is a prestigious profession. But there are challenges. There are rigidities and inefficiencies in the freedom and in the flexibility particularly in our schools, but also in our third level institutions. And going back to something that Brian said, the responsibilities for school management fall disproportionately on school principals. There's the absence of an effective middle management cohort and a sharing of management, and we say the responsibilities for total school experience among the other members of the teaching force in schools. So what are the strategies for the way forward? Continued professional and in-service development, especially within schools. School-based professional development is hugely important, and I suspect it's not something that we have exploited to its greatest potential yet in this country. The entry possibilities into teaching should, I believe, be broadened. We have an excellent cohort, but the cohort mainly comes in at school leaver level after third level education. Teaching would be enormously enriched if there were other people in the teaching force who had experience of other jobs. And in that sense, the advent of Hibernia College, which has not been without some controversy, has, I believe, been a very positive development in terms of an additional resource in teacher training. And very importantly, teaching is such a demanding subject. When we think of it, how demanding it is to speak for 20 minutes here at the MacGill School, teachers do this every day of the week in front of a group that at times can be a good deal less committed than the attendance at the MacGill Summer School. And it doesn't suit everybody. And there should be dignified exit arrangements for people who want to change to other careers. One of the strategies that is necessary is to develop a comprehensive teacher contract which encompasses all dimensions of schooling and teaching. And we need to empower school principals. Choice, controversial subject. It is a reality for many parents and students, and is particularly so at third level. And this is a contrast with many other countries. It's a paradoxical outcome given our history, because the British government in the 1850s divided up the primary school system between the Protestant and the Catholic Church. And it's interesting that we now have developed out of that a more pluralist system. And it's a contributory factor to the relatively strong outcomes with limited resources. There are two aspects to choice. There's ethos and there are other characteristics, and this applies particularly at schools in relation to ethos. There's one cohort of parents whose needs in relation to ethos are not being met, and those are those parents who want their children to have a secular primary education. So what are the options going forward? Because the landscape is changing. Is it public sector ownership and management, or do we strengthen pluralism and choice? Archbishop Martin has been signalling that the Catholic Church position might be changing. Now, some of his other colleagues on the bench have been sending opposite signals, so there's probably an internal debate going on there. But he has suggested a forum to plan the future landscape, and I think he's right. I think we should move forward to a forum. We've had examples of very successful fora in the case of the New Ireland Forum, and indeed in the case of the National Education Convention, both of which produced plausible outcomes to apparently insoluble problems. A possible destination, and this is just one suggestion, is a situation where the ownership of school properties will be vested in or leased to the state, but school patronage organisations, faith-based institutions, Educate Together, or faith-based organisations, as I say, Gaelscoil and the VECs, would manage the schools. This would be based on an assessment for schooling in each area carried out by the Department of Education and Science. This would put the department into a proactive position rather than a reactive position, as it is at the moment. There would have to be widely based and sophisticated consultation, and it is not a case of majority rule. There would have to be provision for minority choices, and part of that new landscape would be shared facilities, particularly in relation to science teaching and physical education and sports. The key features of this distinction between ownership and management: no perpetuity. Every lease, so-called, we'll call it a lease, would come up again after 15 years. Contestability is very important, keeping performance sharp. And the leases will be subject, obviously, to satisfactory evaluation and community satisfaction. How am I doing, Finbar, time-wise?
5 or 10 minutes.
Grand.
I didn't want to give too much flexibility, but at the same time...
Grant. So when it comes to funding, we already have a situation in this country where money follows the student through differentiated capitation grants and PTR ratios. And particularly at third level, additional funding is there for meeting specified targets or specified programs, and there's competitive funding for development projects and for research. This is the model which we should continue to develop and to extend it down to second level and first level. Why? Because I think this strengthens the capacity for autonomy and initiative and innovation, which will be vitally important in an era of scarce resources. So again, it's vitally important in all of this that the centralist tendency during a time of stress to claw back economy, claw back institutional autonomy is resisted. But with, of course, institutional autonomy comes accountability. And I'm glad to hear you stress that point, John. 10 years or so ago, your predecessors would not have appreciated that point. So, well done. Quality, of course, is vitally important. One of the great achievements, which we really haven't rejoiced in, is the establishment of the National Framework for Qualifications, National Qualifications Framework. We're perhaps the leading country in the world now in having this ladder of qualifications. And I agree with the proposal of the Minister that it's now timely to centralise the quality assurance arrangements for third and fourth level into one organisation. The whole school inspection programme, which has been a great experiment, is developing, I think it's developing traction. I'd encourage the Inspectorate and the Department of Education and Science to continue on with it. It is providing better quality information, and there will always be contestability about the information it provides, but it is, I believe, providing better quality information to parents. We should strengthen the gold standard reputation of the Leaving Certificate. I won't go into the pros and cons now of the Leaving Certificate, but we have preserved its gold standard quality. There is obviously a need for development, but we should be very careful. This is an enduring product that has been there for quite some time, so let's experiment carefully and let's develop it carefully. But there should be greater international benchmarking of it, and we should look at quality products elsewhere, for example, the International Baccalaureate, and see what we can learn from that. Internationalisation, it is a missed opportunity. If you just look at the foreign student participation in third level institutions, compare Ireland with other English-speaking countries, because this is an English-speaking market, essentially. And we've only one third-level institution. RCSI is an institution which, incidentally, I'm associated with, which has a major international footprint, contributes about 10 million a year in taxes, in tax payments to the Exchequer. That's an indication of the potential which international education can provide. And finally, research, development and innovation. John has made the case for continued investment and priority in this area very coherently and very persuasively. But we're back to the wealth of nations again. That knowledge piece, the human and social capital, and the importance of consistency. Since the late 1950s, since the time of Ken Whitaker, we have been consistent in our policy on corporate taxation. Since the late 1960s, particularly since the expansion, the development of free secondary education, the creation of what were called then the regional technical colleges, and the expansion of the universities, we have been consistent about education access. We are becoming consistent about investment in knowledge. Ireland has now entered the top 20 countries for the production of top quality, criterion-based scientific literature outputs. That's not a position we can afford to lose, and any perceived weakening of our commitment runs the wrong long-term risk of damaging our potential for economic recovery. Charles Darwin wrote, I think, at the end of the Origin of the Species, you're referring to Charles Darwin, John, that it wasn't the strongest or the biggest of the species which survived, it was the most adaptable. Our capacity for adaptation lies in the quality of our education system. Thank you very much.